Welcome to Practice Disrupted, a podcast where we find ways to create new solutions to current challenges while elevating the value of architects. I'm your host, Evelyn Lee, an architect who spans tech as an angel investor, startup advisor, and founder of Practice of Architecture. Whether you're a seasoned architect or just starting in the field, this podcast is your gateway to think differently about the role architects play within our global community. Welcome to this week's episode of Practice Disrupted. What does it look like to follow your passions to a second career in life? And how do you reshape a career built in architecture into something entirely your own? Today, I am joined by Clarence Kwan, an architect turned solo entrepreneur who recently stepped away from a successful 30-year career in architecture and real estate. Clarence has held leadership roles in both top architecture firms and major tech companies, charting a path that was already unconventional by many standards. But even after all that, he still decided to pivot. Now, Clarence is founder of Curated, a lifestyle concierge service rooted in his love for food, wine, travel, and design. Through this work, he's crafting experiences with the same precision and creativity that once went into his architecture and real estate projects, except now, the projects are deeply personal and designed to spark joy. In this conversation, we reflect on his journey, from growing up in Hong Kong and the UK, to discovering architecture almost by accident in Seattle, to walking away from a thriving tech career to build something entirely new. For those of you that are mid-career and thinking about what's next, or wondering if it's too late to change directions, Clarence's story offers inspiration, honesty, and a refreshing reminder that reinvention is always possible. Hi, Clarence. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Evelyn. Glad to be here.
Yeah, we go way back. I can't remember. I feel like we've known each other at least 15 years now.
Oh, more than that, 3 decades.
3 decades? You think we go back 3? I'm not that old, I don't think.
If I feel old. I am old.
No. But anyways, Clarence and I met ages ago on a committee focused on bringing diversity into practice and into the profession. And, Clarence, I have appreciated seeing you change different roles throughout your career, starting in a very traditional practice, working on large hospital projects, and then going into tech on the real estate side of the business. And then finally stepping into this new role of entrepreneur, and not entrepreneur of your own firm necessarily, but entrepreneur of a business that I think honestly have to say that I know a few architects that would be interested in spinning up a business model similar to yours. So thank you for coming onto the show to talk about your inspiration to become an architect and your aspiration with your new business endeavor going forward. So we usually launch into each episode with an icebreaker. So is there anything that you are looking forward to in the year ahead?
Yes, I just launched my business a few months ago. So, I would like to get some traction in 2025. I wrote in my business plan that I do want to have a break-even point next year. And, while I will remain flexible, I still want to see, it land successfully. I love to travel. So that's something I look forward to. But I do have an aging and ailing dog. So, depending on, how he goes. But the most important thing I look forward to next year is to actually make some new friends and build some new connections, because I've been in a bubble sheltered in the design and construction community. And, for a new enterprise like what I do, I want to break out. That's what I'm looking forward to next year.
Okay, great. And we'll talk about that new enterprise a little bit later in the episode. So you grew up in Hong Kong and the UK. What ultimately sparked your interest in architecture and interior design?
Well, for Hong Kong and the UK, there were actually no inspiration and no spark about architecture. No, zero, not design. So as a person growing up in an Asian household in Hong Kong, you follow a recipe when you're raised. You either go to finance or be one of the professionals, go to university. They don't encourage you to do some discovery of like what you're passionate about. If you do anything creative, it really is a means to an end, like playing the piano or like, draw.
It's a hobby.
It's not even a hobby, it's something that goes onto your application for your university. Then I was sent over to a private school in the UK as a boarding school, pretty prestigious. Things are even more structured because there was actually a goal of getting people to certain universities, and then you kind of have to be streamed to what university they would be, what kind of program. By the age of like 16, is very much like a pipeline, and architecture never came up, design never came up. But I mean, it wasn't all like just sort of force feeding. I did get, some soft skills and made some lifelong friends. The soft skills are actually great for, like, say, how do you communicate? How do you strategize? How do you deal with bullies? How do you, deal with business interactions and that kind of stuff, which is actually in the classic sort of British sort of private school sense. That's what they are famous for, right? So architecture never came up, but this is in the 80s in the UK. That was when the yuppies came out, and it was the new wave music. Cool kids were wearing black all the time. There was Terence Kwan and all of that stuff. So there was a whole thing about design, and there was a whole image of being cool to be a designer and to be an architect. But that was an image, and I was a teenager. So that was really the UK and Hong Kong. I didn't really have much thought into architecture apart from just a little bit of exposure about architecture being cool.
If you were to have stayed on the path, what would have been the plan? Is it like lawyer, doctor, or business?
It would have been engineering. Would have been Cambridge. It would have been something that I didn't enjoy doing, but pretty much one of the few things that I was good at doing, because English was not my first language. So, math, sciences were like the things that, like, by default I was good at doing. So they streamed me to that. And by the end of the high school education, I was absolutely miserable. But then there was actually a chance of course correct. And that's me moving to Seattle for the University of Washington.
So was Seattle kind of always on the intended list? I just say that just because, my parents immigrated here from China. My mom came while she was in college, and there's certain universities in the US, like for some reason, for instance, UCLA is considered as high as some of the Ivy Leagues, right? So if she goes to UCLA, it carries a certain level of prestige still in Hong Kong.
It wasn't. It was actually a little bit of an accident. Hong Kong in the 80s, there were talks. In fact, they actually were negotiated to give Hong Kong to China. And my dad worked for Her Majesty's government. So we had to go. And so my dad, at the age of 50, moved his whole family to the US. And they chose Seattle because at that time it was actually considered a pretty livable city in the 80s. They could have gone to California, but his whole family, including his parents, were in California, so they said no. So Seattle was a backup plan for me because we're moving. And then I only applied for one American university, which is actually University of Washington. It was in Seattle. And so I got in. And then I didn't know anything about American schools and all that. That was the only one. I got there. And the first week of school, you had to go through advisor counseling. And they asked about major. I was like, engineering. He's like, you don't have to do that if you don't want to. I was like, really? You can change stuff? I was like, hallelujah. I mean, this is like a total, sky broke open for me. It was just like, I didn't have to do that. So I just named architecture. It was because it was cool. It was something that, is still following the same conditioning that you need to be of some sort of professional in order to make sure that your life is somewhat secure. There wasn't any encouragement for you to like get a degree in,
English?
some liberal arts. Yeah, exactly. exactly. Not in an Asian American household, you know. It wasn't as if my parents would discourage me from doing that. It was just like so conditioned into how I was growing up that things have to have a purpose. They are means to a certain end, and the end means like, living a decent life,
Hmm.
secure, healthy.
So they were okay with your choice?
My dad didn't like it that much. He didn't say, "You're not going to make a whole lot of money out of that." He's an engineer. He's a structural engineer. But then I started, taking classes, right? And I was pretty good at the design portion, as well as stuff that I actually really enjoyed doing was architectural history and art history. In fact, I did so many classes, they gave me a second degree out of it. So, I took so many. Yeah, it's like there's so many credits.
You went from hating school to loving it, sounds like.
Yeah, that was, so the main major was actually architecture, but it was like I took so many of these things that I enjoyed doing that I got another degree out of it. Haven't thought about it that much, but it becomes useful recently. I can talk about that more. Seattle is interesting because it was actually a regional American city trying to go big. And then with my background, having to be raised abroad, and, I felt like, wow, I'm a popular kid here and all that. And University of Washington had a program in Rome, very robust program, and taught by a professor named Astro Zorina. I went there as an undergraduate, and that's when I actually truly grew up. Things start to tie together well. And, big lessons learned is like the city is built in layers, and so's life. Life is not all about like, compartmentalized. Like this is work, this is, your family. This everything is tied together. And one big lesson that I learned was that food and wine is like a design process. I think I might have talked about it in one of the diversity events that you and I sat in. I was talking about that. It was just like, food is like the design process in the sense that all the ingredients have inherent properties, and you are going to have to respect that. Just like, hey, a tomato is a tomato, is acidic. Concrete is good for compression. So like there's something that you cannot change. This is whatever it is. And then you also have a recipe that is handed down by tradition, by the technology, by, what the culture does and all of that. It's not that different from building traditions and the climate and all of that. So there's all the technical requirements. And you as a chef or you as a designer or an architect is actually the person putting all this stuff together. And what comes out hopefully would be better than the sum of its parts. And so that's the process. I did go back there during my master's to Rome and did my thesis there. But the key thing that happened in Rome was that I came out of the closet. I mean, I've been gay the whole of my life, but that's in Rome, I truly came out, lived openly and proudly as a gay man. So Rome has a special place in my heart. But, until then, it's still kind of a means to an end. It was a craft that I picked to put food on the table to live my life. It's not something that was about passion or calling or inspiration or any of that stuff. And it kind of sort of came back and haunt me lately, but I can tell you more about that later.
So after school, you were doing the traditional practice thing, working in big firms. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about like the type of projects that you were immersed in, at least when you were in practice?
Yeah, yeah. So that's good because, like, so I was school with practically no marketable skills. You go and apply. And I pretty much stuck with big firms. The first firm that I landed, it was MG2. They did a lot of rollout retail. At first, I didn't like it because it wasn't like high design and all that stuff. But then, after I worked there for a bit, I actually enjoyed doing it. And, there were few things because I was good at doing, which is project management and account manager. Being an account manager, was the firm has great people working there, great culture, and there was a lot of travel, a lot of business trip, and I was like, oh wow, for somebody who just have such a limited number of years of experience, they trusted me, and then have me handle all these things, and that was good. I stuck with that firm for 10 years and did a lot of not just rollout retail, there was also like, office buildings, and there were some design competition that I was PMing. It was actually kind of fun telling, the principal architects, the designers to like do this, do that, cracking the whip. So that was good. And then I moved on to NBBJ and was there for another 10 years, more PM, CA kind of role, a lot of different project types. Like you said earlier, hospital healthcare work. That actually brought me down to the Bay Area from Seattle.
I remember we met, you were working on Kaiser Oakland.
Right, exactly. And then also some tech company work. And then there was actually a huge project for Google, and I was down there in Mountain View, a whole 40 hours a week, and I was in the trailer, so I got to know these people. So I leveraged the connections I had with Google, and I actually went to Methuen, which did a lot of tech company work, and I also was sort of anchoring that interior architecture business here in their San Francisco office. It was a great firm to work for. I would have stayed there if there wasn't any opportunity that popped up to work for a tech company. Actually, I was thriving there. So, in terms of being an architect in these big firms, which, you don't have to do everything yourself, I found my niche that I was good at doing. So it wasn't like a bit of like, oh yeah, I wasn't passionate about that. It's a job, and I was thriving. So if you ask most people who are architects, they don't always love it.
I mean, I find myself in a position where people are specifically reaching out to me to talk about career transitions. So I'm definitely getting a very specific type of individual that knows that I transition and just want an advice on how to do that. So what's interesting to me is that you are relatively happy there and thriving, but obviously an opportunity came up.
Yes, exactly. An opportunity came up. So, Meta, which is Facebook at that time, we had some projects. They also reached out to me while I was in Methuen to do their technical guidelines. And I said, why not? And I actually went up to leadership of Methuen. I said, hey, I would like to do that because if you want to be a workplace expert, you need to do everything. And so we did that. And then Facebook ended up reaching out to me and offered me a position to be a design manager. So it was great. It was like, because it was, the tech company back then had a lot of perks and a lot of culture that was fun and all that. And it was a social network. So there was, they made a point of, connecting people, including in the office. So it was a really fun environment to work for. And my job, my my territory is the whole of the Americas outside of the Bay Area. So I was on the plane every week, which I loved. It was just like I've gone to Argentina so many times, and I've gone to Brazil, and then in the US, like quite all sort of different cities. That was great.
So obviously this opportunity came up because Methuen was a contractor of Meta, and then they brought you in-house. A lot of people don't realize that a lot of these big tech firms have an organization within it called REWS. So Real Estate and Workplace Services, REWS. Can you just help explain what REWS is? Because it's actually a relatively easy transition for architects to make into tech if there's an opening in the REWS group.
Right. So these facilities group, be however they call it, different companies have different names for it, but they are basically like a cost center. They don't generate revenue. They are people who keep the lights on and then, negotiate leases and build out the spaces and then run the spaces. And tech companies, generally, the food as well as the security and all that is also falling into that part of their portfolio. They're not that different from, say, HR or legal. They are essential functions, but they're not revenue generating people. And so when we go there as an architect, right, we think that, oh my gosh,
you have to code. When people come to me and about a transition to tech, they're like, I need to go do the code academy, right? Or I need to, change my portfolio for UX design. But in all reality, there are opportunities, albeit smaller now with the return to office situation, where there's a need for your direct architecture expertise.
Absolutely. like the people that are in those departments, a lot of them have MBAs, but they also have subject matter expertise. They are good at space planning. They're good at assigning desks with people of different abilities to different areas. And there are some people who are good at facilities management and then make sure that, I mean, there's certification for that kind of stuff. But architects, same thing. I was brought in as a design manager because I am an architect. And so that's my area of expertise. Now, there are a few things that are different than traditional practice. And I think one thing that is a huge shocker to me when I first started working at Facebook. When I first got there, the first month or so, I was told, don't just dive right in, observe and sit in meetings. No time card, no billability. Yeah, it was actually the first shocker. It was like no timesheets, because it was just you pay by salary, right? And nobody's watching your clock. You just, now I have to go into that a little bit. But then one thing that it was a huge shocker is like when I was looking at the drawings and look at how things happen. It's that I was looking at them. I was just like, okay, if you have a set of drawings and it says blah 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 by owner, blah 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 by others, check mechanical, check structural. After a while, I was just like, so what does the architect do? you know, because these equipment and these furniture pieces are ordered and delivered and installed and coordinated by somebody. And if the architect is not doing it, someone else is doing that. So the huge shocker for me, it was just like, as architects, we always thought that, hey, we do everything. We don't. We really don't. And then we also lost a lot of market share because we don't do this based on this is not our expertise. There's a liability involved in this, that. Then before you know it, if you're not claiming that piece of the pie, you don't get paid for that stuff. If you don't get paid for that stuff, that's why you don't get paid a whole lot, and it goes down the food chain, right? We pay our staff so little is because you're not really doing everything. You think you are, but you're not. So that's one shocker. And the second one was actually we're so conditioned to work on projects. Projects have a beginning and projects have an end. And, sometimes we have like a handful of projects that you juggle, but you stagger the schedule so that, you're not like open the floodgate, bite off more than you can chew.
But also to whatever extent we can stagger, right? Because there's definitely times when projects go on hold, sometimes
Right.
for a year. Like I think I've heard a firm talk to me about how a project went on hold for almost 10 years.
Then you don't count on that one.
There's nothing you can do about it, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But the mindset is still projects. And then when you are in these facilities, real estate department, you are really working on a program. And it's very hard for an architect to think program because projects are within the program to get them to the next place, but rather than, project as something that you just deliver and then you move on. There's no beginning, there's no end. It's very hard to get into that mindset. It's almost sort of like we have to rewire ourselves to play this whack-a-mole game all the time, and which is not good for project management because we're trying to minimize risk, and then and there it is, it can hit you in any directions, or some RTO comes back and you have to reevaluate everything you have done, that kind of stuff.
RTO being return to office.
Yeah. So it's different. I would actually say that to a lot of people, if you go into the tech company, you have to play the game and drink the Kool-Aid, sometimes pretend that you care. Now, in an architecture firm, it's true. Like in an architecture firm, the whole team has a common goal, which is the project, which is the baby that you try to raise, and you want the project to be good. In a tech company, you want to make your boss look good, and then so that your boss looks good in front of their boss. If you have a good boss on your one-on-one, they might start the meeting and say, how can I help you this week? Because we have one-on-one meetings every week, which in architecture firm, I've never heard of one-on-one. One-on-ones are great because they know what you're doing. A good boss would actually help you deliver what you're doing. and we remove hurdles for you. Not so good boss would take your credit and then report what they have done, which is all what you have done, to their own boss in their own one-on-one. So there's more sort of politics in these tech companies. And Evelyn, you talk about like sort of the RTO stuff and all that. Well, the huge part, a game changer of what instigated my transition to a next thing was because back when before the pandemic, and when there wasn't this inflation problem and high interest rate and all that stuff, tech companies were essentially borrowing money at low cost, and they could afford to grow like that.
And the perks were amazing, right? And you couldn't attract people fast enough.
Exactly. And then, in the last couple of years, they were laying off staff. Laying off staff and shrinking headcount means that they don't need real estate. And then it's very hard to be in the in-house real estate department, do anything that is of any substance, right? Just like moving people around, adding lockers, garbage, no garbage, that kind of stuff, This is what, so it became not so fun anymore. That's really like, I start to reevaluate where my place is.
And I want to talk about the politics too, because I faced some of that as well. I definitely ended up under managers we nicknamed empire builders. Like, I have more power if I can convince groups to move under me or convince somebody that I need more headcount to get what I need done. Right. And like, that's literally the game.
It was a game. Well, now, so just for people to understand, right? If you're in an architecture firm, your project is busy, and then you need people. You just hire, and have the project absorb the cost of that person. And then when you're running low, this is a boom bust cycle of architecture firm, right? You get laid off. In a tech company, because we're not really a profit center, you cannot just hire people liberally. Every year you submit a budget of how many headcount you're gonna have, and then when it's shrinking, people start to fight over these headcount, and to get rid of, or rather to get a new headcount, sometimes you have to get rid of somebody, and that's another game that they have to play. It's a little bit of that's the politics, right? When there's a scarcity, people backstab.
And some tech companies, if you look at their career ladders, it literally says that in order for you to be a director or a vice president, you have to be in charge of so much headcount. In a way, it's also, I need to be in charge of more headcount in order for me to be promoted. It's a horrible incentive for growth.
Yeah. So that's one thing to pay attention to, right? Because you are always going to be a support services in these big companies. And I think, so it's not the promised land. People were like, how do you get onto the dark side?
It also really depends on the company, because I was so grateful to be at Slack through the pandemic, and we were acquired by Salesforce, but much of the leadership was there for one or two, a couple of years after the acquisition. And just being at Slack at that moment was a special time. In my head, I'm like, I like working in tech, but at a scale of 3,000 people is like about top, because then it's small enough that you actually know the community of the people in it. You're able to talk to the C-suite. They know who you are. You have connections up and down. You have the ability to lift up people below you. And people are I felt like a lot of the decisions were made out of empathy for where other people were. When you get to 90,000, when we joined Salesforce, we were approaching 100,000 before the layoffs in 2023 and 2024 resulted in a smaller workforce. You're just a number, right?
Yeah, that was my experience. When I left, Facebook to go to Amazon, that was a huge scale issue, and the culture is completely different. And then it just got to a certain point. I was just like, okay, is it worth it? Yes, I got paid a few more dollars than I would in an architecture firm, which is a blessing. If you have to kind of
golden handcuffs. I always say the golden handcuffs were kind of real when it came to making a decision for what's next.
Yeah, but you also are not thriving, and they probably don't like you that much, and they can smell you. So it goes both ways too, right?
Ruse, depending too, also in the company that you work for, I feel is treated like second class citizens, right? Because you are not core to the product team. Like you said, you are a business expense. Unless you're on the product side, there's just a different attitude about you.
You're not bringing me money. You're
Yep.
spending money at the end of the day. And then your client are people that are the user groups that are, getting paid like $500,000 in salary. And they said that, okay, this desk doesn't work economically. And then,
And those were the type of things that you were dealing with, essentially.
the little bits and pieces. So, you know what? The huge part about it is I turned 50 a few years ago, right? Now, 5 years ago. It was a little bit like what I realized is that, time is probably the most precious commodity I have. My dad, when he turned 50, he moved his whole family to a different country. And then after he got his US citizenship, he went back to Hong Kong and started his second mountain to climb, his second career, and he was thriving. He was so happy. He worked until he couldn't work anymore because he enjoyed it. And then that was like, I don't have any kids to feed and all of that stuff, so why don't I apply some sort of a design thinking in it? Even though I'm not much of a designer, it's like when things are not working out, you either reiterate or you just scrap it and then reconfigure it and start again. And so I kind of look at like, well, what am I good at doing and what brings me joy? I'm much more of a curator than a creator. So I thought, okay, well, if I like food, I like wine, I like travel, I like bringing people together, why can't I maximize on that? And then in a sense, it's so hard to define what I do because I basically, if I have to give a 30-second elevator pitch, I'm just like, I'm a project manager for people's life. I'm not a life coach. I'm actually managing your project because life coach means like I have to actually help you. You have to do the work. I'm going to, you hire me, I will do the work for you. That kind of stuff. And there are some people, I think there's a market for that. Now, it's not that easy to get a transition. I have to say, I have to do a lot of unlearning and relearning. There's like 30 years of, bad habits and attitude. A huge part is like in the architecture profession, there's a lot of, you cannot do that. You cannot do this. Oh, this is too much liability. It's like such a huge top-down handcuffing what you can do. I mean, it's ironic that you're in a creative industry, but then you cannot really get that creative because you get sued or the fear of getting sued. And then so there's a little bit of like, I had to overcome an imposter syndrome. How am I going to do that? So I had to take a lot of classes.
So you want to tell us a little bit about what CK Curated is and what you're doing now before you talk about why it was helpful to go to all these small business courses?
So I said that, if I'm good at curating and not creating, and there are people who actually enjoy food, wine, travel, but they just like feel like, okay, the logistics are horrible. They don't like to put it together. And they end up by not going, or they sign up on a package tour. Or they want to remodel their house and then they just don't, they end up abandoning it or kick the can down the road because, they don't know what kind of stuff they like. I'm the person who can actually help arrange that, organize that, suss out what they like and want. Not that different from what a project manager would do in an architectural office. Like, when I was doing my healthcare projects, like a lot of the user groups were like nurses and doctors. I mean, they cannot read plans. So you have to figure out a way to convey to them how what they need and how your response to their needs are in design. Like you might have to build a model, you have to do role playing, you have to do a lot of different things. Same kind of soft skills that I'm using. So that's my business, is to be somebody's.
Enjoying the show? Join a community of fellow disruptors at practiceofarchitecture.com/community. Your membership helps support the production of this podcast, Practice Disrupted, and funds the creation of more resources for all of you. Looking forward to growing together. Join us today at practiceofarchitecture.com/community.
Fixer, for the lack of a better word, in their life.
So when you talk about curating, from what I understand, I mean, you're not interested in full service architectural delivery anymore. You're a lifestyle curator, mostly from like design of interiors on the F part of FF&E, maybe the F and F of the an E. And then, but you just kind of want to be in and out, high level touch, but also a curator for very specialized travel experience as well.
Exactly. So I mean, the architecture part, I mean, I'm still a registered architect in 2 states, right? And, there are a lot of my colleagues, cohorts, people that are listening to the podcast. I mean, they love to build somebody's house or cabin in Montana. And then if I have a client who wants to do that and they don't know where to start, I could actually like say, hey, so and so.
You'll refer them to an architect, right?
Exactly. I don't have to detail the scuppers anymore. Somebody.
You don't have to do that. You don't have to be worried about code or building permit. Well, I mean, code in terms of just accessibility and getting around furniture, but like
the owner's rep.
Yeah.
If anything, that's really what it is, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I do now. So when it comes to like sort of building up a small business, I had no idea what a business plan looks like. I've never seen one. I've never written one. I mean, we've been trained to just design and all these technical stuff. So you pass your ARE and then, you work and all of that. And I, did not know how to do a 30-second elevator pitch. I had to reach out to like the Small Business Administration, and San Francisco has some really robust resources to help small businesses. So I took a lot of classes. When I turned 50, the first piece of mail that I got was from AARP saying, congratulations, blah, blah, blah. Now, it turned out that the most useful class that I had taken so far was actually by AARP, that was actually teaching people over 50 to turn their cookie making business into a gig not because they want something to do when they're retired. It's because of necessity. Sometimes they don't know where their Social Security will be. They still want to have some money left for 2 vacations a year, and they want to leave some money for their grandchildren's college funds and all that kind of stuff. So they want to have some sort of a gig going on. And so, that kind of stuff, learning new tricks is actually very exciting for me. I'm getting wine training. I'm getting trained as a sommelier. And I'm touching up on all my architectural history and stuff like that because I like to tell stories. So suddenly an accidental degree that I got.
And all of that world travel you did as your life as an architect too. Right,
exactly. So that's the kind of stuff that I had to learn and unlearn. I'm relying on my soft skills as a PM, as a people person, stuff that I learned when I was in boarding school in England to tie it all together. In a sense, it's a little bit like a second coming out of the closet to live a more authentic life on things that I truly enjoy. I mean, I'm not saying I didn't enjoy architecture, but sometimes I was just like, I'm not passionate about it. It's just a job. Maybe it's not that uncommon. I don't know. It's a little bit like, I know school teachers who, after 25 years of teaching, say, I cannot deal with kids. That kind of stuff.
Obviously, you're excited and you're following your passion too. And you've kind of talked about how you pursued entrepreneurship through all of these courses. But is it all that it's cut up to be?
No, it's a little bit scary. It's I remember looking back at my first job, first out of college. I had no marketable skills. I mean, at school back then, they didn't teach you CAD. You were hand drafting. So, the first thing that people did when they first got out of school is to like go to community colleges and take CAD classes.
I didn't even know. I didn't realize.
You are much younger than I am. Back then we just like had the hand drafting on Mylar, and then suddenly, I remember the first job interview I had a pretty glossy master thesis bound and all that stuff. It was about like a flea market.
I just want to be clear. I'm younger than you, but all of my portfolios that I submitted to grad school were hand bound. So we're still working. We're still working in that era. Yes.
Yeah. But what I was trying to say is that I remember back in my first interview, the president of the company of MG2 asked me, it's just like, hey, so this stuff in Rome is all good, but how is it relevant to the job? And I actually said that my response is like, this just showed that I can produce high quality work that is from analysis to synthesis and tie it together into a nice package and deliver that to you. I have to channel that kind of start over again mentality to for this job. And it's interesting that when I made the announcement of my launch of my business on social media, I got pinged by a lot of architects. They are kind of not happy with where they are in their professional life. And then I had a lot of lunches with them, and some of them are in their 40s. And I said, if you're already feeling the itch that way, you better learn some new skills. You don't want to like wait until that you are like so depressed and unhappy and deprived that you have to learn this stuff. I mean, like I was just giving them the heads up that, learn new stuff. I mean, I didn't know how to build a website. It took me 5 weeks. I was going to outsource it. I ended up learning and do it myself. It gave me much better control. That kind of stuff. Now, so never stop getting out of your comfort zone and always grow. I think, the key part is like, architecture profession can get really stagnant. People get into their comfort zone. And then when you're in your comfort zone, you're not thriving. Sooner or later, you just kind of get like bored.
Well, your head's down and you're doing the work over and over again. I mean, Janine and I talked about this and why I don't specifically want to do consulting, because in a way I've been doing workplace consulting for quite a long while. So that could have been a natural path for me to take after I left Salesforce and Slack. I had connections through our Future Forum that could have been potentially the path of least resistance. But there's a grind to delivering. And I felt this even when I was delivering like K-12 school. Like there's a grind to the process that you have to go through over and over and over again for consulting. And the only way to scale consulting is to come up with a methodology that you repeat over and over and over again. That's not what I want to do.
Well, so the whole thing is, I'm doing a startup thing, which is not that sort of common for architects. I mean, after all, it's like one of the oldest professions in the world. And then, and you try to like change the way things operate. I mean, I did think about consulting, work for, on contract and all that stuff. I can always fall back on that. And startup is not always going to be successful, but I don't want to get to a point 10 years from now, a lot of could have, should have. I just want to give it a good try. I still have a little bit of money in my bank account for me to, not worry about it for a little while. I do have to watch my budget, just like any startups would, I haven't taken any loans out for that. So, in a sense, it's just like, why not? That's how I look at it. At least I try, and it might make me happier. I mean, 30 years in a career is a pretty long time.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Especially these days, because I feel like a lot more people talk about building portfolio careers.
Yeah, portfolio career is probably the way to go. Putting all your eggs in one basket. It's so weird because when I got out of the tech industry, and I actually had to like fix my resume, and my old resume was really, for an architectural resume, is really more like a CV, right? You list all the projects and all the little bits and pieces. Suddenly gone. All those bullet points are irrelevant. And suddenly I was just like, oh my God, I can actually have a one-page resume because these things have...
A proper resume?
Well, because I don't have a portfolio career. I was a one-trick pony, which is tough, So that's the things that I had been struggling with in the last 6 months. And I think I'm still getting more classes and training and all of that stuff, but I hold my head up high. So,
what advice would you give now to those just entering the profession and how they might consider pursuing their career or looking at their career path over time?
I would say keep the faith, like it's not a dead end profession that you have to abandon. You go to school and then, took the ARE and put a lot of work in it, but don't put all the eggs in one basket. Really learn about these soft skills stuff, basic things, business plans, and think about, don't let people tell you that you have to put in all the time and it's a gray hair profession and all that stuff. By the time you get gray hair coming out of it, you might have a lot of regrets too. So that's what I have to say. Just keep your options open.
Hi, Disruptors. Thank you for joining us today on an episode of Practice Disrupted. If you like the content for today's show, you can find all of our past episodes over on practiceofarchitecture.com/podcast. Be a part of the conversation by joining me, our speakers, and other disruptors in our community at practiceofarchitecture.com/community. Our social media handle is Practice of Arch. That's Practice of ARCH. We'd love to hear from you, so feel free to drop us a DM and say hello. Tune in next week for a new conversation on change in the profession.